Hey there guys, welcome back to Tabletop Glory. My name is Graham Johnson, and today we're going to be tackling the beast that is non-metallic metal. Specifically, we're going to be doing silver, because we've done gold already, and it didn't turn out half bad. There's still some things that I need to kind of figure out, but honestly, considering I'm red-green colorblind, I thought gold was going to go way worse, which means we're definitely going to have silver on lock, right? These shades of gray make stone! Ugh. It couldn't have gone that bad. Okay, so if you guys have seen my non-metallic metal gold series that we did last year, then there are some familiarities that you're going to come across in this video, especially some of the reference material. So if you want to just skip forward to the point where I start painting, that's cool, but there's going to be a few new things along the way and some things that I didn't say back then that I want to say now. So if you think you could tough out rehearing some of the old content to get to that new stuff, I'd really appreciate it if you'd watch the video all the way through. So, continuing forward, non-metallic metal is a process that has existed for a very long time, and really amazing references to this can be found during the Renaissance era, in which painters used colors that were not metallic, meaning they were not shiny, to replicate metallic or shiny surfaces or finishes. And one of the best examples is armor. A lot of times gold and silver armor is done up in a very specific color palette, but depending upon the environments, those colors get tweaked one way or another in order to replicate those armors in those environments. A really good example of that might be you might add some green into your silver when it comes to the shadow regions in the bottom of the armor to replicate the reflection of grass, in assuming your subject is standing in a field. Now, if we take a look at some of the examples that I used in the previous video, as well as a couple of new ones that I have found, you will get a good understanding of how much white and black should be added to your original colors that you're using to create your base to get your full gradient. But also, the more contrast that you have, or the more mid-tones you add, can really develop from super shiny to dull and matte. And in my opinion, for me, what was working best was the more mid-tones I added and the less contrast I had, the more of a matte finish the armor seemed to have. So now we've got our basic formula and our basic math to figure out just how much contrast needs to exist to get the type of finish we want. Now, typically this would be the point where you could kind of just run buck wild and figure out what works for you and figure out the colors that you want to use. That's not as simple for me. With my color blindness, I kind of need to have a base formula to go off of, and then mix and match and tweak my own formula out of an existing formula. For me, it's very hard for me to tell what colors I'm looking at when I'm looking at a subject, to then be able to go to my paint palettes and pick out all the colors that I want to use. I have a really hard time doing that. I have to have a good understanding of what colors are already there. So I tend to go toward other miniature painters in the community like Miniac and many others to see what colors they're using to use as a jumping off point. But this doesn't always help. To put things into perspective, I'm going to put two images on screen. One is going to be of silver and one is going to be of gold. You get a good idea of just what could be used for colors to kind of give yourself a good representation of that on a miniature. Like, what kinds of warm tones would you use to paint gold versus what kind of cool tones would you paint to use silver. And now I'm going to put a color blindness setting on both of those images so you can see what it's like for me. And suddenly those answers aren't so clear. Now, luckily I wasn't born colorblind and I don't deal with this to quite the extreme that these images are, but I do genuinely struggle at times, and I honestly didn't think that my color blindness was going to affect my ability to paint silver, because the cooler colors that you typically use to do silver are colors that I shouldn't be blind to, but it seems the fact that my eyes are so oversaturated in what it takes in versus what I'm completely colorblind to in the case of the gold armor, it actually resulted in this being a very, very difficult challenge that I was not prepared to deal with. I feel like maybe if I had done some little minor experiments here and there on maybe some blades and stuff instead of going full hog for the armor right away like I did, which you will see soon enough, maybe this story would be a little different. But this was a really hard challenge for me. Now, something weird to keep in mind is that when I'm looking at silver, I know that there's blue in there, but my eyes have a hard time identifying the amount of blue that is in silver. And I feel like there's a fair number of people that don't realize that there's blue in silver, and it's not always necessarily because it's reflecting the sky. I remember when I took an art class in college and we had to do a still life, there was this beautiful sparkly pink ribbon, and I know it's a weird way of putting it, but it was so elusive for me to be able to nail down, to be able to paint it. I had the same art professor for 2 different classes, and I had to do 2 different mediums with this stinking ribbon and could not figure out for the life of me that there was a hint of a metallic sheen to the ribbon, an almost satin-like finish, which would have told me, had I known back then, that I needed to include some blue in my reflections to have been able to have created the proper illusion, but I didn't know that, and I kept trying to do it with whites and grays, and it just destroyed the color. And when I look at silver, my brain just screams at shades of gray. But as you'll see by my first attempt, I keep trying to correct with shades of gray, and I just end up with this painted stone look. And maybe I wasn't doing half bad, I'm just being a little hard on myself with my first attempt. But with my second attempt, starting with a much deeper blue as opposed to starting from a gray backdrop, I immediately felt like I was making better forward progress than I was from the first attempt. And I mean, it was night and day. And I did both of these attempts back to back. I think I only took about a 10-minute break in between the 2 of them. Another thing that kind of got on my nerves was the fact that when I was looking up other people's formulas, they were using a much brighter blue than what I ended up using in my final result. And maybe that's where I went wrong in my final result, because I feel like the final result, although I am happy with it, feels almost like ice armor. I don't think I nailed silver, but I think I got it so close that the next time I make a serious attempt at it and really want to sink some serious time into it, I think I have a formula for success now. But starting from this darker blue really changed my perspective on things, and I think I was off to a much better start my second time around. One thing that stuck with me that I kind of thought about halfway through my second attempt was that I remembered that when I did my non-metallic metal gold finish, that I realized I really should have started from a much darker tone, that my final result, although I was happy with it, just wasn't quite dark enough. And maybe that's why I was so chuffed with myself about my second attempt, because I had learned that lesson and started much darker than I needed to, even if I was going for a silver as opposed to an iron type finish. skipping ahead a little chunk of time here, we can see that I'm really starting to lay out my white in my second attempt here, and this is when things started to click for me. This was when I realized that I needed more contrast. Now, I was trying to do things by memory at this point, but I failed to pull up a reference image, and I realized, well, that's dumb. So I pulled up a reference image and suddenly realized that I needed a lot more contrast than what I had been using so far. And even looking at my original, I realized that my non-metallic metal gold, I could have used quite a bit more contrast, and I really would have ended up with a much nicer finish. Again, if I had started with a much darker brown as my base tone for that one, I would have gotten a much better finish. And looking over at my first attempt and seeing my second attempt side by side now in the editor while I'm watching this live, I can really see that, yes, starting from this darker tone gave me a better understanding of where I needed to end up. And this sudden revelation of needing this high contrast, I have a much better understanding of where I need to end up. So how could I suggest applying this to you so that you guys don't fall into the same pit traps that I did? So applying this, what would be a good suggestion going forward? Something that I'm going to do absolutely for sure is that when I know where my extreme highlights are early on, go ahead and block those out early on. I kept finding myself trying to go through my midtones and into my highlights to make sure that I got those midtones in there. But sometimes when you're going from your extreme contrast, from your extreme darks to your extreme brights, dependent upon the shape of the armor, you kind of just skip over those midtones altogether, and you just blend your extremes together for a very, very small fraction on some of these smaller pieces of the armor, and that really alone sells the illusion. I kept referring to it in the live streams as almost like a comic book type style, where you see the extremes of the most brightest brights and the darkest darks, and you don't really see too many of the midtones. I feel like this is a really great jumping off point to set yourself up for, to give yourself a bit of a roadmap to know where you're going. So don't be afraid to go ahead and put in those highlights early on, because remember, we can always cover it up with a darker color. That's super easy. But covering up a darker color with a brighter one isn't as easy. Now, on my first attempt at this point, I'm really focusing on those midtones. I started feeling like maybe if I just block out my midtones and do a mild glaze of my midtones all over the place, I can go back in and set up my contrast for my darks and my lights. And then I just wasn't happy. No matter what I did, it just felt wrong. And maybe if I had seen it through and not stopped like I did, I would have ended up somewhere where I would have been happy. But I think I would have ended up in the exact same ballpark that I did for my non-metallic gold, where I just didn't start dark enough. And although the final result was okay and spoke for itself, I don't think the final result on my original attempt, well, I don't think I would have learned anything, which is why shortly after this point, I just kind of stopped working on it. I started talking with Chad. I made a few little extra highlights here and there, but I had really just given up on it at this point, and I really wasn't happy with it. And that's when I decided to start on attempt number 2. Now, perhaps it's a lesson in putting the cart before the horse, but sometimes I like just blocking out the model. Now, yes, today's video was just me originally working on trying to nail down non-metallic silver, but you'll know that I really like something and feel like I'm really learning when I feel like I need to take a break to soak it all in and I start working on other parts of the model. And as I continued to work on this model, I realized that I was a lot happier with the silver than I initially thought I was when I started blocking out this color. It really allowed me to see where the model was going to end up when it was all done. And although I knew at this point that, again, the armor looked a little bit more like ice than I probably wanted to, I knew I had actually genuinely learned something from this experience as opposed to just repeating my mistakes from the previous attempt. Now, that having been said, despite blocking all this out and spending a fair amount of time on the front, I didn't paint the back. I really painted this to look good in photos, just like your average YouTuber, because at this point, I was kind of tired, and it felt like a lesson in futility, while also being happy with the result, which was a weird oxymoron of a feeling. So if I could sum up today's video into 3 or 4 things that I learned that I'm going to be taking away from, but I also feel like the average person could take away from this, is number 1, if you know where your highlights are going to end up and you know where your shadows are going to end up, go ahead and block those out early. It's going to save you a lot of time in the long run, and especially when doing something like non-metallic metal, it's going to give you an excellent roadmap so you don't get lost along the way and spend a bunch of time working on things that don't need to be worked on, like midtones in tiny little objects, when you can just do some fancy pants wet blending. Speaking of wet blending, I already knew this, but maybe you guys didn't. Wet blending is unbelievably important for doing non-metallic metal. You're oftentimes blending many different colors together, including just blending your highlights and your shadow colors directly on the miniature. If you are not familiar with wet blending, don't feel bad, but it is something that I would highly recommend that you practice before attempting something like non-metallic metal. Number 3, reference images are everything. Get as many reference images as you can. For me, I really enjoy getting them off of Pinterest because a lot of them are geared toward people making like comic books and drawing manga and things like that, and can oftentimes be far more beneficial than grabbing something like a Renaissance image, although a Renaissance image for me is highly inspiring, so you may want to grab one of those as well. And finally, you're not gonna know if you can do this unless you do it. I watched tons of videos trying to prepare myself, but nothing really prepared me as much as just starting. Just try a little bit, and if it's not making sense, then go seek out more reference material. But if you have been doing lots and lots of YouTube homework like I do before I attempt one of these projects, and you're just not sure if it's gonna work out or not, I mean, you're not gonna know until you try. And if one of the biggest things that's holding you back is you're scared of messing up one of your models, there are a lot of hobby stores that do what are called paint and take days, and those are things that you can work with your local game store to set up. There are plenty of companies that will provide paint and or miniatures to a local hobby store for them to be able to host an event at an absolute killer bargain or even for free. Games Workshop actually provided the miniature that I am using for this video free to my hobby store for me to be able to give away to people who came into the store back when it was still open. And I have tons of these things still left over, and GW just gives them away. So if your local store does GW, it's a really great way for you to get your hands on a couple of free models for you to kind of mess around with and do some experiments like I do. In any case, guys, thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to leave you with the final results here, but in any case, may your display case always be filled and your pile of shame never run empty. Thanks so much for joining us today.